Hello and welcome to the next episode of my Learn With Me Hydrasynth series. This is episode 6, Mutants, part 3. So first, what is this series? Well, the Learn With Me series is a series of series starting with an Op6 one, where I go through my end-to-end process of learning to get the best out of a synthesizer. This series is for the Ashen Sound Machine's Hydrasynth Explorer. The Hydrasynth Explorer is a simplified, in terms of form factor, but not in terms of sound engine, version of the original Hydrasynth synthesizer. The original Hydrasynth had 49 full-size keys, and it had 8 encoders and 8 buttons and corresponding display for modifying your sounds. This one has 37 mini keys and 4 encoders and 4 buttons, and a way to move through those in a page-wise fashion. So far, I've talked about my general opinion on the synthesizer, we've listened to some presets, I've described the architecture in reasonable detail, then we've spent some time designing sounds using the oscillators, the simplified oscillator 3 and the other 2 oscillators, and moved on to what I consider the next logical point, which is the mutants. So the first question you're probably asking is, what are mutants? Well, mutants are audio effects which are applied to the output of the oscillator before it reaches the mixer. We can see that on the signal flow diagram. So oscillator 1 passes through mutant 1 and mutant 2 before reaching the mixer. Oscillator 2 passes through mutant 3 and 4 before reaching the mixer. Oscillator 3 does not have any mutants, and in fact oscillator 3 is a simplified oscillator which could be thought of as a sub-oscillator, but is more than that. So let's look at one of the mutants. As we've seen, you press the button to go to that section. We can see this is illuminated, which means there are, in this case, 2 pages of parameters associated with this. One thing worth thinking about is traditional FM synthesizers work on sine waves. Sine waves are useful because when you do phase modulation instead of frequency modulation, the outcome is equivalent if you're using sine waves. If you're using other waveforms, the outcome is not equivalent. So it turns out that phase modulation is far easier to do and implement and cheaper than true frequency modulation. So early FM synthesizers used phase modulation and were therefore required to use sine waves to do exactly what they claimed. This synthesizer actually uses phase modulation, and phase modulation works perfectly happily with any type of waveform, but it will not be identical sonically to a true FM form of that modulation, but that is not really relevant to our purposes. But we're going to be using sine waves. So oscillator 1 is a sine wave. I should probably initialize the patch before I do that. So oscillator 1 is now a sine wave. Let's look at the settings for the mutant. The first mutant is the FM. It's a linear FM process. And let me recap a little bit about what ratio means, because we've seen it a few times. So though these are audio effects, they do know the pitch at which the oscillator is sounding. So they understand how much audio corresponds to one cycle of the waveform of the oscillator that is incoming. So when you are making settings with respect to the frequency, you're actually picking how much audio is being manipulated in a block. So this ratio of 1 means that the unit of processing is equal to the wavelength of oscillator 1. It turns out, though, that that parameter only applies in certain cases. Well, why is that? I'll turn the depth down just so we can bring the signal up. So notice the depth is 0. This is how much of the FM effect is applied. There is now 0, so we're listening to the frequency modulated sound, but nothing is actually happening. Now, what is modulating this incoming audio? The incoming audio is being modulated by a source which can be chosen here. The default source is oscillator 1. So in this case, oscillator 1's audio is being frequency modulated by oscillator 1. This is feedback in an FM synth, and it is something that is used moderately frequently. Let's listen to what it sounds like. So, So what it sounds like to me is like opening and closing a filter on a relatively harmonically complex sound, and that's a good way I find to think of FM synthesis. This is not an FM synthesis tutorial. I may go and do a separate video describing how to do FM in depth, but this is more an analysis of this mutant for now. So that was feedback. We have various sources available to us, specifically the output of all the oscillators, the output of ring modern noise, and the output of all the mutants. But if we go back in the list, we have two other sources, sine and triangle. So sine and triangle are modulators that are going to be generated by the mutant. So you can think of the signal generated by oscillator 1 as being the carrier, and the signal either selected from a source or generated within the mutant as being the modulator which is applied to that. When you're using the sine or triangle source, you can specify this ratio parameter, which means at what frequency is that generated compared to the frequency of oscillator 1. So to give you an example of that, if I hold down shift when I turn the ratio knob, it's going to go in whole numbers, which are going to be the harmonics of the original sound. So let me play a note. Let me turn up the frequency modulation. You may note that that sounded the same as feedback, or almost the same as feedback, and that is because the ratio is 1. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to latch that and jump up through harmonics. So hopefully you can hear that depending on the ratio, but in those harmonics, it still sounds harmonious, but the timbre shifts. If I tune without tracking the harmonics, you can hear that there are a lot of inharmonics that are available there. So that's the nature of FM synthesis. An interesting thing that you can do is, because this is an audio effect, you can adjust the wet-dry balance. So if I bring this up to, say, the 5th harmonic, I can bring back in the original sine wave if I wish. Now, you may note feedback here, and you may think, oh, well, that's feedback. That is modulating the signal by itself. Well, that's not actually the case. Since this is an audio effect, what it's doing is it's sending the output audio back to the input. So you're feeding back the carrier to itself. This isn't really FM feedback. That's just something worth knowing if you thought that was FM feedback in the traditional sense. So I think we've covered the basic sounds that we can get here. Or rather, we've covered the basic timbres without modulating anything, and I think it's a bit dull without modulating anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly put together a 2-oscillator sound, both of which are going to be FM modulated, and I'm going to throw some envelopes in there as quickly as I can, just to try and get us a more classic FM sound. So this one can have a ratio of what? Can I do? 1.5 maybe. So when you're setting ratios, unfortunately there isn't a very convenient way to make really fine adjustments to these. Shift locks it to harmonics. Anyway, when the ratio is a rational multiple of the incoming frequency, then you'll get something fairly harmonious. When it is an irrational, you will get lots of inharmonics. And also, when it is a rational, the higher the numbers in the ratio, when it's in its simplest form, the more inharmonic you're going to hear. So 1.5 is half of 3. 3 is the 3rd harmonic. So this is the equivalent of the 5th in the same octave. Anyway, not particularly relevant. So let's say oscillator 2 is going to play a bit higher. So I'm going to set oscillator 2 to a sine wave, 12 semitones up. Then the mutant, I'm also going to use a sine wave source, and this one was 1.5, so I'm going to set this one to 2. I'm going to make this 100% wet, And now I'm going to turn this up and solo it. So this is oscillator 2, oscillator 1. So both of them presently have maximum modulation. This amount of FM depth is maximized. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn them both to have minimum. So now we just hear them playing in unison, but there is no frequency modulation occurring. Why would I do that? Well, because I would like to modulate those frequency modulation amounts with a pair of envelopes. So first I'm going to set myself up a amplitude envelope. So let's make that 6 seconds long. I'm going to make something that's just a classic pluck. So you see if I hold it, that continues for 6 seconds. I'm going to do operator, let's see. So this one is higher frequency, so I probably want it shorter. So I'm going to make both of these shorter. And maybe this one will have a decay of 4 seconds. This one will have a decay of 2 seconds. So I'm going to make them all roughly the same shape. And this can have a release of 2 seconds. Down. And now I've not really introduced how to do this, but what you can do is you can press a modulation source and a destination, and it puts it in the mod matrix. And I want to adjust the depth. And let's say I want to adjust that at 100% intensity. And the next one to the next mutant, I want to adjust the depth at 100% intensity. Already I quite like the sound of that. What I'm going to do is add a little velocity sensitivity. And I'm going to add a little filter to this. So let's make this even longer. And let's make this modulated here. So I think you can hear we have some of that relatively distinctive metallic sound that FM brings. I'll quickly throw some effects in and I'll just play some things. So I think FM usually likes chorus. So a little delay. Maybe a little room reverb. Should be fairly small. Guess that should be fine. And let's see if there's a post effect that I want. Tremolo maybe might be interesting. So that was effectively two operator FM sounds layered on top of each other. As I said, I may do a video going into detail about how to make classic FM sounds on this synthesizer and really understand how to define your algorithms more clearly. But in any case, I think that has brought us into the territory of classic FM, and it's something that often is not really accessible to you on a subtractive synth like that. So hopefully it goes to show you that there is more to the Hydrasynth than meets the eye, and the mutant section provides a lot of tombrel flexibility, even if I didn't bring the filter into that, or even if I didn't bring the effects into that. So in any case, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining me today, and goodbye.